Hi, my name is Sid Chopra. I'm sitting here with Dr. Scott Huettel, Jerry and Patricia Crawford Hubbard Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. Dr. Huettel got his PhD in experimental psychology from Duke University, and he was the founding director of Duke's Center for Interdisciplinary Decision Science. Dr. Huettel has won many awards in innovation, teaching, mentoring, and has authored over 100 scientific publications, wrote a textbook on functional magnetic resonance imaging. He's also been rated as one of the top 5 instructors at Duke University and is the past president for the Society of Neuroeconomics. So Dr. Huettel, what is neuroeconomics?
So neuroeconomics is an interdisciplinary field where we try to understand why people make the decisions they do, and we combine both measures of their behavior, like in behavioral economics, with measures of brain function. So by combining those two, we think we get a better handle on why people make the decisions they do.
So why is this important to us in general, our society in general?
I think part of what you can see in recent years has been this groundswell of interest in behavioral science. So we're trying to understand why people behave in ways that don't seem to fit sort of traditional rational choice models. And there's been a recognition that behavioral economics is something that can help us explain the biases that people show in many weird situations. But the big challenge for behavioral economics has always been that it doesn't have any sort of doesn't have a deep theory. There's not one model that helps us replace traditional economic models with something new. And we think that neuroscience can help us guide us towards some explanation for behavior that lets us replace traditional ways of thinking with new understanding about how real people in a real environment make decisions.
So Dr. Huettel, what can neuroeconomics, and for that matter, neuroscience in general, tell us about the way we make decisions that, for example, cognitive psychology wouldn't?
Well, neuroeconomics is not something that's going to replace decades of really good research on cognitive psychology, judgment decision-making, and other sort of better established longer-term fields. What I think it does is provide some sort of grounding or coordinating ideas that the biology, and our particular biology, constrains how we behave. What I mean by that is often in psychology or economics or the social sciences, we have an idea about how people behave, and we can look at the data out there in the world and draw inferences. And we don't really know if the mechanism we think is going on is the actual mechanism driving behavior. And neuroscience gives us another important sort of source of evidence that can help define the underlying reasons for the behavior, and then we can apply it to new situations. So if I learn about how the prefrontal cortex, say, contributes to decision making, I might be able to then map what I understand onto individuals that might have a different prefrontal cortex, such as teenagers or younger children, and be able to better take my theory and sort of explain behavior in new situations. And that's something that's hard to do in psychology if you don't have a connection to the biology.
You know, one of the things that you had talked a lot about in your course was the human biases, the cognitive biases that we have. What exactly is a bias?
So one way to think about a bias, and as the term implies, is where somebody gets something wrong. And I don't think about it that way. It's a useful shorthand, but it's not really what a bias is. A bias is really where we're applying a decision tool that is adaptive, it's something we evolved to do, but we're applying in the wrong situation. So a lot of the times we see biases because the skills that we have as decision makers work really well in sort of natural settings, when you're interacting with people or some physical object, but they don't work as well when you're dealing with something very abstract, like an event far in the future, or something really intangible like you're investing. And so I think of biases are basically where you're applying the wrong tool in the wrong situation.
Now, these biases, are they hardwired? Are they something that we have acquired over time?
Well, most psychologists or evolutionary anthropologists don't think there's a clear distinction between, let's say, hardwired and not. So we evolved and grow in an environment, and the environment has a lot of structure to it. So, for example, we recognize that light sources tend to come from up because that's where the sun is, and not from down. And our visual system is set up to have that sort of expectation. And it's not hardwired per se, but as we develop, we are exposed to light in a particular way, and that causes our brains to grow up in a particular way. The same thing happens with decision biases, that there are some things that are structured in the world. There's regularities in the physical environment, and our brain is set up to look for those and to grow accordingly. So I think of it as hardwiring is not in the immutable sense. It's that we evolve to expect an environment that has regularities, and as we develop, we are set up to pick up those regularities. That leads to good decision-making in many contexts, but it also can lead to problem decision-making precisely when we encounter a context that's outside of normal evolutionary history.
One of the issues that we have a lot of in work environments is our response to stress. Oftentimes, our body manifests stress in a way that is inappropriate for the conditions that we're in. Our blood starts going into our core, we start sweating, our heart starts beating. These are responses that were appropriate when we were, foraging for food in the jungle or in the deserts 1,000 years ago. They're not so appropriate now. Are these biases that you were mentioning, some of these biases, were they the cost of evolution, that these are things that were created way back then, or are they completely learned behavior?
So I think about something like stress, or let's just broaden it to other types of emotions and feelings. They're not something that's just simply maladaptive, that they are adaptive in many, many contexts and maladaptive in some, usually a few. Stress is very adaptive. It's something that lets you get through a complex world without having your body completely break down. It's signaled to other people. People can recognize when you're under stress and they adjust their behavior accordingly. And in many cases, like you are under real pressure, stress can be very adaptive. It narrows your focus to the single most important task on hand. Where it's problematic is often when it occurs in things like a random work situation, where that random work situation in many ways shouldn't generate the type of life stress that, say, the injury to a close friend should. But a system that was adaptive for dealing with major events, social context, physical injury, and things like that gets co-opted for, say, workplace, bad events at your workplace. And so, again, the way to think about it is not stress is bad. It's that a system gets used in contexts that it shouldn't be used. And so part of managing stress, just like part of dealing with any sort of control of your behavior, is trying to match the behavior to the context.
What are some of the heuristics that, if we're trying to convey information, that we need to be aware of?
Well, probably the most important is, and this is not a heuristic, but a way of thinking about heuristics generally, is that heuristics are at root simplifications. So what a heuristic means, you can almost translate it into simple rule. And that implies that in many, many cases, people cannot and don't use all of the information that's available to them. They're going to take a subset of the information and process that in a way that's pretty quick and effective. And so what that means for a presenter or anybody trying to communicate is that you should recognize that your audience will never even hear, much less use, everything that's presented to them. They are constantly looking to simplify, to categorize, to apply one of these rules to what you're presenting. And one of the things I think is important is to try to control that process. If for example, you have a major point counterpoint, calling it out, making it clear that you know what's going to be compared, translating it so that they understand that we're doing that direct comparison is usually better than just assuming that people will pick up on it. Some of them will, but many of them won't. And broadly what I'm suggesting is the idea of sort of controlling the process of simplification. And doing that will almost always, regardless of context, help the audience at least have a common perspective on your talk. And if you can get them to have a common perspective, then you might be able to control other aspects of the talk a little bit better.
You also mentioned something about framing and also anchoring. Does the use of, and your knowledge, I guess, of both of those topics, has that influenced the way you present?
Right. Right. So framing is this idea that people will take the same information and reach different sorts of decisions depending on which features of the information are made most important to them. And the simplest ways to do this is make, for example, taking a decision that has both gains and losses, and whether you cause them to first think about the gains or first think about the losses. And the same information can lead to a very different decision. It's a very general, sort of process, because it can apply to any case in which you can take the same information and present it different ways. And so in that case, it becomes sort of trivial. The way I think about framing is again, controlling how people simplify. So you never use all the information. You never weight all the information the same. So if I'm presenting to somebody a set of results from one of our experiments, I may want to point their attention to one subset and let that guide how they think about it. And what that may, again, sounds sort of trivial. Like, of course you always do, but you don't. I mean, often what people do is present information as if everything is equal weight. Or will present information and avoid primacy or recency effects, presenting the most important information in the middle. And often my strategy is to make it completely clear to people about this is the feature of what I'm telling you that you should attend to, and let them work from that, and then maybe add the other information on top of it. So it's basically trying to frame the situation along the lines I see as important, rather than sort of put it out there and trust that they will simplify that way.
So you've said basically the way we present information, the structure of the presentation can actually lead one person to one kind of a decision versus another kind of decision.
Absolutely.
And this is at a neuroscience level.
Well, it's one of the things that we are hopeful of is that when we say a conclusion about how people process information, we want to see it at every level. So I want to be able, if I think that people process information, and take one example, something called reference dependence, that we process information in almost every case with regard to some reference point. Not in absolute terms, but whether it's better than worse than our expectation. If I think it's a true sort of description of people's behavior, I want to be able to see it at individual behavioral level, but I want to be able to go down into the brain and be able to see that there's a mechanism that behaves in a plausible way. And I want to go up into society and say that it's actually manifest in larger scale societal outcomes that I might care about. And if we can see it at all those levels, then we're pretty confident in it. So I don't think it's like that we should think of it as because we have the neuroscience, now we have the answer. There's a set of levels, that all of which are important, but neuroscience has often been the omitted one.
The omitted one.
Historically, I mean, if you think about how long we've had insight into, say, economic behavior, we've had reasonable models of individual economic behavior for 4 centuries now, ever since we started talking about how people use both probability and value in their decisions. And we've had models of macroeconomics for centuries, for several centuries at least. And neuroscience is the new kid on the block in a lot of ways. But because it exists, it does not take away from the earlier models of individual or societal behavior. What we want to see is convergence across these levels, that one story works across everything. And I think in the best examples we now have that. And so we can tell a story about how people behave that goes from their brains up into society.
The common refrain I've heard in talking to other neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists is that we're not logical decision makers. We're really emotional decision makers. Does that bear true?
Well, I have a lot of problem with that language, and it's in part because it's sort of glib, meaning, and I think you're accurately you're reflecting what people say, but the distinction between reason and emotion in some ways becomes a straw man distinction that very few people will ascribe that the idea that individuals are really rational. That doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't make sense. And if we take macroeconomic behavior, it sort of works like people are irrational, but not really. Behavioral economics is clear that people are inconsistent in their behavior, and we of course know people who are emotional. And if we look in the brain, there are no really rational regions or emotional regions of the brain. There's nothing that we can say is uniquely emotional, uniquely associated with logical reasoning. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that people have a set of of processes that they can bring to bear on decisions. Some of them seem superficially like we might call an internal emotional state, but that doesn't mean that there's a real distinction between that and, say, calculated reasoning. If anything, I would make a nuanced change to that argument. People aren't rational. I'll agree with that, even under any distinction of the word. But that doesn't mean they're always emotional or even mostly emotional. What it really means is people don't have access, in many cases, to the rules behind their decisions. Internal states matter, but all kinds of other unconscious and sort of unobserved processes will change how you make decisions, and they don't have to have any emotional valence to them. It still may be something that doesn't fit some sort of calculated reasoning without having any emotion at all.
So the biases that we have is really, in one way, is a toolkit that we've misapplied.
Absolutely. And I think it's a nice way to put it, that if you think about the traditional models being there's a right way to make decisions, you consider costs and benefits, you integrate them in a calculated way. I don't think that we're little accountants. I think that we're closer to workers who have a toolbox, and then you have a situation and you reach into the toolbox and pull out the tool, and it might be the right one for the job, or it might even be the one that seems most natural. But then, a different tool might work better in this context. And so the brain it's sort of, to use a different metaphor, is that the brain's like a Swiss Army knife. It has a variety of different ways of dealing with problems. And, the type of way that seems at first blush to help you best deal with the problem may turn out to be the most effective one. And in some cases, we bring to bear emotions because that is an effective tool in many situations. But in other cases, emotions don't really matter. They're not even part of a decision. And so you can simplify a complex decision, make what seems like a rational, sort of intuitive choice, and have no emotional state associated with that. So I don't know. I think my best way of putting it, I think, is that if we can put away the idea of sort of reason versus emotion as something that fits our intuitions but doesn't actually match on how the brain works, then we can move to some sort of better models, which might involve different ways of thinking that don't get sort of hung up on that intuitive but wrong idea.
So if we were to go with these different models and a lot of the research that you've already done, how could we, if we're trying to convey information to others, leverage that knowledge, understanding the human biases and the heuristics, range effects and other things that you've also done research in? How could we leverage that to better present information?
So again, part of it is recognizing what your audience will do when they get information. In some cases, ideas like reference dependence can have a lot of power in a presentation. So again, this is the idea that people think about information not in absolute terms, but always with reference to some other point. And one way I think about this in presentations is that you need to control that expectation of individuals. For example, if you present something that you think is counterintuitive, and you haven't developed that intuition beforehand, it's often very easy for people to say, that's not counterintuitive, I can come up with a story. It's often much more powerful to come up with a story ahead of time. So as you're presenting an idea, say, well, one possibility is this, and walk them down a path that leads to a seemingly and completely logical conclusion, which you then demolish on the next slide. Once you've done that, you've basically established something which seems like a very reasonable reference point, and then you move away from it. If you just present the counterintuitive story from the outset, then what that invites them to do is to come up with an explanation that makes it plausible, and you lose the power of the presentation. So I will often, when I talk, be trying to tell people about a story that just doesn't make sense, and come to a particular way of making sense, and then show them that way of making sense is plausible but wrong. And then it becomes much more memorable to them.
That idea that you had mentioned actually in your great courses on behavioral economics, you had mentioned that we resist when an expert tries to tell us information, we resist that. You also mentioned that maybe a better way of presenting that information, instead of saying I'm the expert and here's what we know, is to nudge them. And that was a term that you used. I guess I don't know. Is that is nudging a scientific term?
Well, it's a term that's gotten a lot of publicity since a recent book by Sunstein and Thaler, who described interventions that sort of maintain the autonomy of the person who's making the decisions, but influences the way they make the decisions. And they call these things nudges. It has a connotation. It's a gentle push, but one that the person could resist if they really wanted to. And in general, the better way to motivate people's behavior turns out to be setting up the decision situation in a way that they will more naturally make the desired decision. Where instead of either forcing them or trying to force them, especially if it's cheap talk, you can't really force them, or just giving the information. When you give people information, they look for, as you mentioned, counterexamples. When you try to force people, then they see that as a threat to their autonomy and they resist. Many people will do self-destructive things in order to assert their own autonomy. But if you give people a different decision situation, you change the situation in a way that preserves our autonomy, but leads them to almost, if you keep the metaphor, to pull a different tool out of the toolkit, then the behavior can be shaped in a way that often is better for them and better for society. So that's the argument that's come out in the Sunstein and Thaler book and in other popular press recently, that one of our goals in decision science should be to find those ways in which people can still have the ability to make a range of decisions, but we set up the choice architecture in a way that leads them toward the decisions, again, both best for them and best for society.